Hello and welcome to CM4D Basic Training. In this module we will be looking at the creation and options available for text boxes and some of the general options that come with annotations on the white space. So in the previous exercises we focused on creating data sets, data stacks, and some of the main operations and functions included within both. We looked at how to create sift rules, how to select data from the data source tab. We talked a little about the statistics tab and also the event tab where we can set up logic conditions. But once you have a data set created for information that you want to report, we've seen that you could right click on View Data Set and Grid, and it will list again the contents of that data set. Well, with text boxes and with annotations, we want to connect to this source of data in order to display whatever information that we deem necessary for that object. So again, to connect a text box, I'll delete this for now. First we need to create one. So above in the icons that you see, there are some that are used to create different types of objects in the white space. So we have text, we have view, chart, table, line, shape, container, picture, and graph. And what we'll be looking at is here, text box. So what we can do either here or through annotation, if we go to annotation, that same list applies. If we scroll over new, we'll see the same list there. So we can either choose it here through text or click on the icon for new text. That will create a new marker for your cursor to indicate that you're in text mode in order to draw your initial text box. So when you draw, it will start from the upper left corner of this icon. And if I click my left mouse button and then hold down, I can size initially what the size of the text box will be. I can change what that will be. So it's always good to create a size that is large enough for text to be viewed, but small enough so that you can make multiple text boxes on the page. Anytime you have an object on the page, you can always click and resize by clicking on one of the squares that are located on the corners or the perimeter of the text box. So I can click and drag that if I want to, or drag it back down. And then there are some options for the text box as well. So this is completely blank. There's no data. But let's say we want this to display the feature name for the data in this data set. So we have 10 points loaded in this data set. And let's say we want to display this name. Well, to do that, we use something called system variables in CM4D. So with text boxes, thankfully there's a bit of an easy way in order to get to the system variables. There are many, and a complete list is found in the CM4D help topics. If you go under CM4D variables, there's the overview for the different types of variables that you might want to see. The basic ones that are used mostly are the nominal data variables. And all variables have the form of a tilde sign, the variable name, and then a closing tilde sign in order to signify that that's a variable. But again, there's a big list. You can go from A to Z and list all of them here. There are some, again, that are used commonly, and those will probably be remembered, and then there are special cases where you will need to use a particular variable for a specific circumstance, but in general, they're all available here along with their descriptions. But there's also a short list of variables you can get to from the text box. So we have the text box. If we right click on it, there's something called edit mode that allows us to edit the inside of that text box. And here we could type in text. If we hit exit, that text would be displayed. But in edit mode, we can also access a smaller list of variables. If we right click, there is an option called insert variable. We can choose that, and from here we can determine the type of variable we want to see. So if we want to show the feature name or the feature label in this box, then this first variable here where it says label of feature, we can click on that one. It'll show us the actual variable declaration in the text, and then we can hit OK. That variable will be thrown into the text box. So if I do that and hit exit, if you notice, the name doesn't resolve. Instead, we have this label with an E, an exclamation. That's a resolve error because right now the text box is not connected to any particular source of data. So in order to get the variable we put in the box to actually resolve to a proper name, we have to do like we did in previous exercises, which is connect this object to a source of data. And in this case, what we can do is connect to the first row of this data set A. So if I right click and go to properties of the text box, I'll have a list of different tabs that are designed for different functions. Now, whether you're in a text box or you're in a chart or even a data set, there's always going to be what's known as a data source tab. So this tab is how we connect the object we are in to a source of data. So in this case, we want to not connect on the left-hand side or directly to a query, but we want to connect this text box to this A data set. So we would look here on the right-hand side where it says data set, choose the data set option, click on the drop down, and choose data set A. Currently it's saying use all rows. So if we kept this option, it would basically try to resolve the feature names for all of the rows in this data set into one text box. I guess I can show that briefly if I use this and say all rows. If you notice, it kind of runs on. You'll see like the names blur together. That's because it's trying to put all feature names for all, if I right click and go to view, data set and grid, all 10 of these rows, it's trying to put all 10 of these names into the text box. So if I right click and go to properties and go back to data source, I'll have to make sure to say either use row 1 through 1 so that this now looks at just the first row. If I go back to data source, say row 2 through 2, now it looks at the second row. If I set row 1 through 2, it would resolve the first 2 rows and therefore put 2 names in the text box. But in general, when you're dealing with objects, you're usually trying to look at data for one feature, so therefore you'll be looking at just one row. The other thing you could do is say use feature and connect to a particular feature. So the difference is if I say use the first row, and now it's looking at the first row of this data. But in the data set itself, if it's using something like a list, which it is here, if I change the order of what is on the first row, for instance, if I click on this row and drag it above so that that red line goes to the top and then let go, now I have a new feature on row 1, and the text box would now be looking at a completely different feature. So in practice, you can have objects looking at a particular row, but if the ordering in the data set changes for any reason, then you could end up with problems with a chart that was designed to look at one feature, now looking at a new feature because of how the ordering has changed in the data set. So the way to get around that sometimes, if we go back to the properties data source, is to say use feature and it'll point to a specific row or a specific feature name, and this text box will look at this feature regardless of what row it appears on. So you point it to the particular feature name, and then here for characteristic, depending on the data that is in the text box, you can click any and it will resolve to whatever data exists for that particular feature, or you can choose specifically X data, but it has to be something that is in the data set. So now this is looking at this feature. This feature is on row 2. If I go back to my data set, and change the order, so again I can click and drag up, or I could also click and choose this move up, move down. And I've placed this back at the first row instead of the second row. But although the row ordering has changed, the text box is still looking just at that one feature because of the function here of looking at the feature instead of the row. So in general, this is something that is good to do after you've developed your report or your template. Typically, you would use this option to look at the first row. That will make it easier for making other charts through different methods of creating new annotations for the layout. And then after the report would be created, you could use some functions to switch the annotations from looking at the row to looking at the actual feature on that row, and therefore making the ordering in the data set something that no longer could potentially mess up the ordering of charts on the page. Now let's look at some of the cosmetic options you have available for text annotation. If you want to change the coloring or change the font size or the look of the text box itself, how would we go about doing that? Well, if we right click and look in this options menu, there is a quick menu for coloring. This is for the coloring of the border of the chart. So currently it's black. If I choose maroon, it will change the text and the border for the chart to that color. Same for any of these others. So this is a quick way to change the coloring directly for the text box and the data within the text box. But if you want to be more specific and change individual options, what you can do is right click and go to the properties of this text box. And in here, there is something called styling. So on this first tab, down below, you'll have an area called style. So right now, it's choosing an option called embedded style. If you click on the drop down, there are two other types. Use score for style, conditional style. These two are for making the style or the look of the text box dynamic based on what data it is reporting. So you can set up certain rules that will change how the object looks depending on the value it's reporting out. Those will be looked at in detail in another module, but just know that those options are available. If you want to make static changes to the text box, though, you would stick with this embedded style, and then you would click here on Setup. So again, not only for text boxes, but for charts and graphs and other objects as well, there will usually be this style area under the first tab of the properties for that object. And when you go to setup, this area would be the same for all of them as well. You'll have a series of tabs that control different aspects of the look of the object. So the first tab is about choosing a base style. In the software, you can create styles and save them off to use in other objects, or you can modify styles in the object itself. If you did save off a style to use in an object, you could pick it here under base. Right now we have default text as the base style, but if I click on the drop down and if I saved another style type, you would see it underneath here in order to pick that particular style. I can show that very quickly. I'll hit cancel, cancel. So styles that operate at the document level can be created if I go to the top here under document. I can go to styles, and here again, this is the list of all the default styles that come with a new document. But if I hit new, I can create a new style. If I hit edit, I can change the name of that. I can choose what its base style will be. And then through the other options here, which are just like the ones within the text box, I can change certain aspects of what that style will be. So if I do that, and then go back into the text box and go to setup here, I would see that new custom style appear beneath for selection in this options menu. So that's one way, is to create a style that exists at the document level that you can use in your objects. But if you're trying to create a style at the object level, you can simply go into the properties, go to style, and then change or modify the settings for these individual tabs. So for instance, we have pen. This controls the look of the perimeter of the object. So right now it's black. If I chose red, and then here where it says base, I can turn those off so that I can make modifications. If base is turned on, that will use whatever the base option was in the base style that was selected here. So I'm going to turn that off, and here it says solid. For width, if I make that something thicker, like say 1.5, and then hit OK, if you notice, it makes the border of the text box much thicker, and it makes it red. So that's what pen is for. Brush is about the interior of the object or the text box, what the coloring will be within this area. So if I go to brush, right now the option was set to none. I could set that to, say, light silver. If I do that, it changes the area inside to that color. This hatch marking is about whether you'll have a flat color or if you use something like a diagonal cross, up diagonal, down diagonal. Such as that. That's vertical lines, and so on. And if you stick with none, it will go back to a blank or uniform color. The border, again, has to do with the perimeter of the object, but here we can change settings for the border type. Right now it's known as a box border, but we can choose none, inscribed ellipse, or circumscribed ellipse. So this is circumscribed because the border circumscribes the actual box of the text box. Inscribed will make that oval on the inside of the border of the text box. You can also do things like shadow, which will create a shadow to make the text box pop out a little more on the white space. And then the depth of that shadow can be controlled, I believe, with this scalar value here. So if I make that 1, it would reduce the shadow size of the text box. Then also we have something with margins. We can have margins turned on. So that's about the margins on the inside of the box. So if you notice now, this value is a little further down because we increased the margin for that. Font is how we can change the styling of the text itself. Of course, you can change the color of the font type, the font size, whether it's underlined or italics, the weight, whether it's very thin, normal, or bold, and then the alignment of the text in the object. So if I did center center, it would always center whatever the text is within this object. The orientation is about whether the text will be horizontal, vertical left, or vertical right. These two options would have this text read in a vertical manner, which might be necessary in certain cases if the text box were longer. So if we did vertical left, we would have to change the sizing of the text box to make it appropriate for that font style. Wrap text allows data if the characters or the string that appears in the text box escapes the border. Wrap text would automatically allow it to wrap the values around. So that applies more to if you had more phrases in here. So if I type some additional words, and turn that on, then it would automatically wrap the text so that the data doesn't escape the borders of the text box. Size to fit is similar, except it will shrink the data to accommodate the borders. So those are most of the options for the style properties for a text box. There's also formats, so if you wanted to be specific about how many decimal places would appear for a number that will be displayed, whether it will be signed, and then here for field, it has lead character, whether it's spaces or zeros, and the width of those spaces. So if I change this back, usually that would work in conjunction with the value here, where instead of center center, if I just say center left, and then go to format. So actually, I think this field width is about actual numbers that resolve within your text box and making sure that characters line up with each other. So for this, you can choose whether the number, the total field or total width, that's the total number of characters that will be displayed. If you choose spaces, then if you have a number that has two decimal places, so you have the value, a decimal, and then two places, let's say that the number will always be a total of 4 characters. So the width would really be 4. But if you had a positive and negative as well, you could make the width 5. And that being the case, the numbers would always line up within the text box. If it's a positive or negative number, it would have a space, then the positive negative sign, the value of the integer, your period, and then 2 other values. So again, the field area is helpful for when you want to align numbers within a column to be displayed within the text box. So the next tab that we can look at when it comes to text boxes is the General tab. And General tab looks pretty much the same for all the major annotations that you will put on the white space. In General tab, you can name the actual annotation here. And that's for later on. Once you have a certain style that you like, you could actually save off this annotation to a network folder and have that as a template to be used or loaded into other text annotations if you wanted to at another time. So yeah, you can save off all the styling and the cosmetics of the text box to be imported later on. But here in the General tab, you can rename it. You can select a certain status for the text box. For instance, right now, I can move this box to any location that I want. But if I go back to this general, I can decide whether the box is locked. If it is, then I won't be able to click on the box unless I hold the control button. Then I can click on the text box. So that's what the locked operation does. It means that you can't click or access the object unless you're holding control. So I can left click or right click in order to get back to the properties of this object if I'm holding control while it's locked. The position itself can be locked as well. That just means that the box can't be moved from its current location. No draw simply means that you can choose not to draw the object so that it appears invisible on the white space. However, if I click and drag a box to the area where that annotation is, it will highlight. So the box is there, it's just not being drawn by the software. So if I go back to properties, general, I can turn that off. And then there's a special object here, or option, draw shrunk. That's for special cases there. Now down below there is an area for loading a file name. This is for cases where, again, you're trying to save off the cosmetics that you've modified within the text box and you want to save it to a network folder to load at another time. This is if you have one saved already. So what we can do to see something in here is this. I'll click OK. There's an option if we liked the cosmetics we have so far for this text box. We can right click and choose Load Save and choose Save to File. If I do that, I could go to the network and go to a folder that's there for the standards in CM4D. And in here, if I wanted to save the chart type, I could say something like this, trading text box, or any other name that helps you specify the function and reason for the existence of that template. So if I do that and hit save, it's going to save it as a text template, a .tex file. And then later, if I go back to properties and go back to general, you'll see that it put in the path to that saved export. This option, eligible for reload, just means that if I open this document, the CM4D document, I could do a setting to automatically reload that style again. So if someone made a change to the style to update it and I need to update the template, with this turned on, I could click a reload function and all the annotations that have this option turned on would look to this path where the template for the annotation is saved and reload that. So if there are any changes that were made to this template, those could be updated into all of the annotations using this option instead of having to do it one by one or manually. So there is the ability to save off the annotation here. There's another tab called Position, which we'll go to. Some of these other functions will be covered in other modules, such as the event operations. That's more for conditional styling. Execute action, these are for special cases where you can put an action button on a particular annotation. But the next general tab is Position. This is the one where you will see the coordinates on the white space of the particular text box that we're in, or whatever annotation we happen to be in. So here it's giving you particular coordinates. Those can be changed if you want to format the box to a certain size or shape. So this is giving you the top edge, the left edge, bottom edge, and the right edge in terms of the grid structure for this white space. Also, you can set the scale here. Right now it's default at 1. If I made the scale 2, then this would be twice as big. But when you change the scale, you lose the ability to go into edit mode directly for the object. So the scale must be at 1 if you wanted to go into edit mode and make changes inside the object. So that's position. Data source we covered regarding how we can connect to a source of data for the text box. Leader is how we can connect this text box to the proper feature marker that is shown on the included CAD image. So with leader, what we would do is click on use data source feature. So that means use the nominal information of whatever feature this object is reporting. And then we will tell it to draw to a particular view, because you can have more than one view object on a page. And again, each object has its own name. So if we click here on feature located in view, we can choose a drop down and choose the name of this view object that's on the page. And then finally, where it says attach at, these are locations off of which a leader line will appear. So these are attach points. So we can turn them off or on depending on where you would like the line to be drawn from the text box. If they're all turned on, then by default the line will draw from whichever corner or edge is closest to the feature on the image that it's drawing to. And then the stub length and leader thickness, this is the length of the stub coming off from the object, how long that will be. Right now that is set to 5. If I hit OK on this, you see it's drawing a line to this particular feature marker. But the stub length is this length here. So if you wanted that to be shorter, we could go back to here, change this to say 1, and that would decrease the length of that stub coming off of the text box. The leader thickness is the thickness of this line. We can make that bigger or smaller. I said 1.5. That would increase the thickness of the line. And then use annotation style. That will use the same style as whatever is going on for the annotation if we did that. So since the annotation has a red border and a light gray brush for the area, it's doing the same thing for the leader line. But if we wanted to change the style directly for this leader line, we can go here to the Terminator page. This is about the termination of the leader line. So right now it says Terminator type arrow. We can choose another type, whether it's arrow or dot, change the sizing of that. And then if we go back here to leader, actually, instead of using the annotation style with that option, we can just click on style and change what the leader itself will look like. So here, We can make the pen and the brush black. Perhaps make this thinner. And of course that would change the thickness of the line there as well. If we make both of these 0, makes a straight line. And if we wanted to make the Terminator itself a different color, let's see, dot for that. I believe that was the brush. So let's say we want to make that yellow. We get something like that. So those are some of the major options, major tabs for the annotation for text. If we wanted to duplicate this and create another text, thankfully you don't have to go through the process of creating a new text box and doing that all over again. Instead, we could click on this text box, hold Control and drag, and it will create a new text box for the next row from where the first one was looking. So we could repeat that process. And as you see, it's making text boxes for the different rows. Now, right now, this data set is just loaded with 10 features, so eventually this will run out. When that happens, you'll end up with a text box that does not resolve because it's looking at a row that does not exist. So this right now is pointing to row 11, but there are only 10 rows in this data set. So again, those are some of the default options that come with making text boxes. A little bit of how to save off the styles, how to make changes cosmetically, and affect the formatting inside the text box, as well as enter variables into the text box to display. One last thing I'll say is that you can enter more than one variable at a time. So say perhaps we wanted to see what the mean value is for the data it's reporting and the type of data. What I could do is put in variables for those. If I do the CHR, that's the variable for type of data. So if I did this and then type mean equals and then tilde mean, this would be a combination of using variables and just plain text in order to display information within here. So now it's displaying the mean value. So let's say that I wanted to get the other text boxes to look like this one. Well, again, I can right click, say load save, save to file, and update the save that I did. I could right click on one of these, say load save, load from file, click on the template I saved off, load that in, or if I wanted to make a multiple update, I could click on a text box, and if I hold shift, click on everything that I want to change, and then if I hold shift and right click on one of the text boxes that I want it to be like, I would get this option, copy properties. If I choose that, it will copy the properties of the last one I selected onto the previous ones that I selected. So again, those are some ways that you can make updates or changes from one text box to another, either by loading the format that has been updated or by doing a copy property exercise. There are some other ways to also update at the document level so that you don't do it for every page, but we'll get into that in module just dealing with template design and creating the layout. So with that, we'll end the module for text boxes, variables, and some of the major options. Thank you for watching, and we will see you for the next module.